And we need to depersonalize the argument. The aim and object is really that our argument and our evidence brings the reader to a conclusion, not the fact that we're saying it. So instead of saying, I am concerned that, we would rather say, it is of concern that, make it impersonal. The findings show, it follows that. So using impersonal constructions with it, and making your findings, or your evidence, or your argument suggest things, rather than you, the researcher, is very characteristic of academic writing. And then I think we've talked before about first-person references, that generally speaking, they would not be used. So you wouldn't say, I and we in your dissertation, first-person pronouns, although you will find it in some of the journal articles that we look at. Again, the principle being that we want to be as conservative as we need to be in dissertation writing, because we are being assessed and judged on our ability to use the conventions. So it depends on your field, and it depends on your subfield sometimes as well. Your supervisor will guide you with regard to that, but generally speaking, you would not refer to yourself as I. You would use those sort of impersonal arguments that we've just mentioned instead. Okay. Yes, Rose.
Sorry, Caroline, can I ask a question? You often see in writing that instead of using I, you then get the researcher everywhere. Can you comment on that?
Thank you, yes, right. It's just an indirect way of saying I. And just as I've said, you would rather claim that your argument produces a conclusion for your reader. If you say I or the researcher, it's coming to the same thing. The researcher, I won. Those are not appropriate. You're not avoiding being personal by saying the researcher. Believe me, your reader will not see it as being impersonal, because you are making a claim for yourself as the researcher. So rather use those impersonal constructions. Yes.
I just wanted to follow on from that. You often hear that your voice needs to come through and what. So what does that mean if you can't say I or the researcher?
Okay, sorry, at the back, you may not have heard that. You're often told that your voice as the researcher must come through. So if we can't use I and we can't say the researcher, we can't even say one, what do? We've actually touched on this in, I think, both the workshops so far, where we've talked about the kind of language that you use. Say when we talked about the literature review, those of you who are here will remember that even the verbs that you use to describe what other people say, you can indicate your attitude to that work. So you can say author X suggests that, or author X postulates that. By choosing those kinds of verbs, you are saying, well, I'm not totally convinced, but I'm sure. That would be one way in which your voice would come through. Even these impersonal constructions, if you say, it is of concern that, it is clearly you're making an assertion about yourself. Okay. So that would be, and just the fact that you select and organize your material in your own way, not just regurgitating or just following somebody else. Again, you can think of the literature review, you're not saying Smith said, Jones said, Flamini said, Sabia said. The fact that you draw out themes, discuss it, that's your voice coming through. So sometimes we do think about voice as being I think, but it's not as simple as that.
So if you've done a review and you want to, you didn't find something that you thought you might find, and there's a gap. So you say, as far as we know, nobody has written about, the pink ostriches in the Karoo. How do you say that?
What you would say, a survey of the literature has revealed no studies or no discoveries of pink ostriches in the Karoo.
But if you don't, then somebody can say,
So
but
your
there was
survey,
one.
yes, but you're saying a survey of the literature has
Our
shown.
survey.
A survey, because what's the implication of that? That you are claiming that your survey has not, but you're not using your. It's a subtle thing.
Because then somebody's going to say, oh, but there was one, and then you didn't include it, so what's wrong with you?
Well, a survey of the literature to date has not revealed. There are ways to play with this. Yeah. Yes, has not ascertained. Yeah. Okay. Nice. All right. So are we sort of happy about that? Our voice as a researcher needs to be clear, but mostly your disciplines will say that you may not use I. So you have to use these other academic conventions for indicating what comes from your research work rather than is from somewhere else, from another source. Okay. Okay, now we've talked a lot about being straightforward. Can you see this at the back? You can read it. Good. We've talked about being straightforward and clear and simple to some extent. But there is a place where academic writing tends to be a little bit more complex than other styles. So I just want you to look at that little bit of text there. I've rewritten it from an academic text to try and make it non-academic in a sense. What I've tried to do is to make sure that the subjects and verbs are clear rather than what happens in the academic text. Look how much shorter it is, where the nouns are packaged, a lot of meanings are packaged up in nouns and noun phrases, which is very typical of academic writing. So when I say you've got to be simple and straightforward, sorry, although it has been argued, see, we don't know who's arguing, there would be a reference in there, you obviously have to say who has been doing the arguing. It has been argued that the old judicial management provisions, so look at old judicial management provisions. Now, you guys are not lawyers. I'm not a lawyer. So that is really difficult to understand. But within a discipline of law, it would be very clear. I tried to unpack it. Legislators should fine-tune the old way in which the law provided that an appointed supervisor should manage a business which has failed. It is so clumsy. And look how that very complex noun phrase is able to package up those meanings. If you are in the discipline and you know exactly what judicial management provisions refers to, okay. Otherwise, it becomes very clumsy. And English is very, it's got this amazing capacity to attract more and more information into the noun phrase, which is very useful to us as researchers. And I'll go on to explain why this is really such a useful thing, and which is why it's so characteristic of academic writing. Just look at the next bit there, rather than outright replacement, okay? The complete overhaul of the Companies Act of 1972. In my rewrite, I've had to say when the legislators completely overhauled. You see now I've put in the subject and the verb. The original talked about the complete overhaul and packaged up that whole sentence with the subject and the verb into a noun phrase, the complete overhaul, without having to say who did it. All right? With the complete overhaul of the Companies Act invited an opportunity to throw the old regime overboard. Old regime is another way of saying the old way in which the law dealt with these businesses. So you can see that this capacity of noun phrases to become dense with meaning is actually very useful to an academic writer. And we'll go on to talk about the ways in which you can use this, but it's just less cluttered. All right? So you can almost create a key term, as it were, like judicial management provisions. And you can write about judicial management provisions without having to explain, you know, who and how and why and who did what, because it's all packed up like a little suitcase. It's like a suitcase, your noun phrase. Have a look at the examples here. Our study advances and tests a model incorporating both institutional and resource explanations for why firms adopt certain structural modifications. Look at that for a noun phrase. So you can incorporate all kinds of additions into your noun phrase that tells you what kind of model it is, namely issues, management, structures. So now the writer has said, okay, I'm going to give it a term, and carries on to use that term. The study provides a model to account for variation in the development of issues, management, structures. Having now set up the term, having explained to us really what it means, that term now can be used, issues, management, structures. So now, what's nice, you've got a noun, so it can become the subject of your sentence, and then you can go on to say things about issues, management, structures. Okay. So this is one area in which academic writing does tend to be complex. And some people who write on style sort of say, no, all your sentences should have an actor and an activity. But there are other theorists who say this is part of the way we become technical and formal in our writing. Have a look at this example. So there you've got a whole paragraph about what has happened in terms of courts with regard to talking about people who have occupied illegally, have occupied accommodation. So courts have recently been at pains to incorporate detailed descriptions of the squalid conditions that prevail. Sorry about that. Flying apostrophe, that prevail in informal settlements and inner city buildings that have been abandoned by their owners as a reminder of the circumstances that unlawful occupiers have to endure every day. So courts go into details and explain what it's like for people, what their living experience is of this. Courts have also grown to include a detailed overview of the history of the occupation to highlight the daily struggles of these unlawful occupiers. And now look how nicely the author takes all of that information and puts it into a little suitcase. Despite this acknowledgement of the realities of the accommodation of impoverished groups, now he is going to talk about this acknowledgement. So having read the first two sentences, we understand exactly what he means by acknowledgement of the realities of the accommodation of impoverished groups. We know this is what happens in courts, and we know the kinds of realities that are being dealt with. And we know what what the writer means by impoverished groups, and packs it all up into that noun phrase, this acknowledgement of the realities of the accommodation of impoverished groups. So you can see why it's useful to us as academics. Sorry, this is very small. I hope you guys at the back can read this. Have a look at this. Policies which are developed to uplift impoverished people without their participation in the most appropriate way to do so, that's a heavy noun phrase. Fail to acknowledge their dignity and impede their right to enjoy all rights and freedoms equally. Then the writer wants to talk about these policies which are developed in this way for these people to achieve these particular things, and he does it by packaging it all together in this position. And then he can talk about that position. It's exacerbated in the case of evictions that are sought in the name of health and safety considerations or development. So we're doing that all the time. We talk about things and then we try and package them up so that we can say further things about it. It's almost like building a staircase. You say, you make a few assertions, and then you package it up when you get to the landing, and then you go further dealing with this position, and now you say something about this position. You first of all establish the position, and then you can talk about the position, because you're able to package it up into a noun phrase. Look at the next example, that this increase in life expectancy. This one actually works very nicely. You can see the sort of staircase effect. Recent advances in medicine have led to the rapid increase of the number and percentage of the elderly population of the world. So we're starting with medicine and how it's affected the elderly. They're living longer. There are more of them now. In many instances, this increase in life expectancy, and you see how that packages up the previous sentence. Now we can say something about it. We've established that this is the case. Now we can say something about it. This increase has required the elderly to relocate to urban areas to ensure that healthcare facilities are readily available. So now the writer has established something else. Packages that up into such resettlements and then has something to say about that. Have brought the elderly closer to their children and the much needed care and financial support that they can provide. Here comes another little suitcase noun phrase. The increased dependence of the elderly on their children. Okay, so that's what you've established. Now you put it into a noun phrase so that you can make a statement about it. Results in them featuring among the most vulnerable and unprotected groups in any community. So you see how skillfully the writer has used the tools from the toolbox of language that he has to move from advances in medicine and how they affect the elderly to showing how, building up an argument as to why this has caused them to become vulnerable and unprotected groups. Using exactly the same strategy all the time. Making an assertion, packaging it up into a noun phrase so that he can make an assertion about that, packaging that new assertion up into a noun phrase so he can make a further assertion, and builds up an entire argument that way. Okay. Any questions or theories? Oh, one thing I think I do need to say. Very often, if you look at the first paragraph, the second sentence, this position, very often writers just say this. This is exacerbated in. Now that's problematic for your reader because sometimes it's ambiguous as to what this refers to. So this is why this sort of suitcase word, or in the literature they're called shells, shell words. Position is a shell which incorporates what was in the previous sentence, packages it up. Put in a noun as well, this argument, this position, this finding. Put in a noun which packages up what you've said before, because this sort of can dangle and be ambiguous. You can see the writer in that next paragraph does the same. This increase in life expectancy, not just this. That can be very problematic for the reader to understand what it is exactly you're referring to. Okay, so let's look at reader-writer interaction then. And here we're looking at particular tools in our toolbox for ensuring that we interact with our reader in our text. And I'm going to talk about 3 ways in which we do this. One is by anticipating the reader's needs. Now this is really important in a dissertation. It's a long document. Your reader can get lost between chapter 1 and chapter 6 because there's so much that you have to say. So you need to anticipate readers' needs. And we've talked about this before in terms of what my doctoral supervisor used to call advanced organizers. We love that expression, advanced organizers, where you organize in advance. Tell the reader what the structure is going to be. So the following section will discuss X, Y, and Z. So you've told, or it will discuss 3 particular features. And then you know that there's going to be a section on each feature. So you organize in advance for your reader. And there are other things that we need to do also, anticipating readers' needs. But that sort of thing where you have introductions and summaries and conclusions, so as to keep your reader apprised all the time as to where you're going in the text, so that the reader can keep with you and never feels lost. Same sort of thing. You need to be thinking about how might a reader respond to this? If you're saying something that you've said before, you're repeating it. You don't want your reader to say, hang on, there's some repetition here, I'm sure I've read this before. You want to acknowledge that you are repeating it. So you say, as expressed or as discussed in chapter 2, and then you reiterate. Then your reader's pacified. They know that you haven't you're not a sloppy researcher who's just putting stuff all over the place. You know you've dealt with it in chapter 2, and the reader feels safe, right? You're reminding him, her of it, and on you go. So it's those kinds of things. That's where your supervisor or a critical friend, a friendly reader can be so good, because we don't always know how a reader might respond. So to get a reader's response is very helpful to understand what the reader's needs are. Then I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we can achieve the right